So let's start maybe with a little bit of history, because a lot of you guys out there might have heard of the name Rivera in combination with maybe a certain artist. One of the recent, like, more popular artists was Mick from the guitar player of Slipknot, who has a signature amp with Rivera, which is called the 7. And so that's one. But the history goes way back. So everybody who knows the history, fine, maybe we can fill in some gaps or not. But essentially, in the mid-70s, there was a very popular guitar store in North Hollywood called Valley Arts Guitars. Valley Arts Guitars was also very popular because at some point they started producing guitars. Meaning, at some point they started making custom guitars for certain session players, like kind of tailored to their specific needs. And at some point, Valley Arts became kind of a hotspot for all these session guitar players, like guys like Steve Lukather, Tommy Tedesco, Larry Carlton, many others. They came into the store for repairs, for customizations, not only of instruments, but also of amps and electronics, which was Paul Rivera's department. So he essentially oversaw that, and then he was... And back in 1976, he was already consulting for other companies. So I think that one thing that came up when we talked beforehand was he was consulting for Yamaha back then. Yamaha was about to launch the G Series 2 amplifiers. And a lot of his ideas went into the final product. These amps back then, they were solid state, but they behaved and sounded very much like tube amps. And they're still very highly sought after. So if you look at, it's difficult to get those, I think they're called the G50 112 and the G100 2x12. And it's the 2 series amplifiers. And they're still very sought after. So if you can get one, normally it's at a kind of a higher price. Kind of similar to the Lab Series amps that Norlin was producing back then, where Bob Moog was involved. They also were like kind of looking after this, okay, how can we build a solid state amp that behaves as much as a tube amp as possible? So he was involved in that. Then, he continued to modify and improve a lot of like different amps for session players. At that time, most of those amps were like Silverface Fenders, the amps from that era. And he added stuff like he added channel switching, additional gain stages. He added like a very cool like pre-gain fat switch, which we're going to get into. Effects loops, master volume, so everything that the session player needed, because these guys needed to go to the studio and offer a palette of sounds coming out of one amp. They could have bring more stuff, but time was money even back then. So you needed to be fast, and you need to be able to bring something to the table. And I think we gathered a list of like players who were using Rivera modded amps back at the time. And I think I've put it all together. So on my list, there is Steve Lukather, Chet Atkins, Jeff Baxter from Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers, Robin Ford, Ted Nugent, John Sykes from Whitesnake, Bruce Kulick from Kiss, Jason Bieler, the guys from Skid Row, Rudolph Schenker, Paul Jackson Jr., Lee Rittenauer, Larry Carlton, Dean Parks, Jay Graydon, and so many others that were using the amps, but also giving him input for coming up with these modifications. They said, for example, talking about this pre-gain fat switch, they said, I love my Silverface Deluxe Reverb, for example, but there's too much information in the low end, and sometimes if I want to drive the amp, it's just blowing up. So essentially, he put in a filter that would take some of the low end out to make the amp tighter in a sense, in a way. So a lot of these things obviously came into existence because these guys went to Paul and they said, "Hey, this amp needs to have that and that and that. Can you do that?" So essentially, that's how he started. And I was digging into this a little bit deeper. In fact, Steve Lukather used a Rivera modded Fender amp for the recording of "Hold the Line" from Toto.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So since Paul added a second channel to the amp and a master volume, so you could drive the amp, it would. And I think he also fiddled around with the tone stack. He extended what the tone stack could do, and it had kind of a Marshall-esque sort of vibe to it. So he was using that, and then that same amp was actually used on Michael Jackson songs, including "Beat It" and "PYT." So,
yeah, it's what I find particular about this is that this is just an opinion. It's like my observation is that because this particular engineer, Paul Rivera, lived in and around like Hollywood, where all the big studios were back in those days.
Yeah.
It gave him the opportunity to work with people that weren't just like working in bars. These guys were touring, they were playing huge sessions. So he got feedback from them. So he, not only is he like a great engineer, but then he's taking great ideas from musicians that were out in the field. He was taking all of it and building it for them, and then like doing the research and development as he went along so he could perfect his gear. I mean, a lot of musicians that become like amp builders don't have that. Like they live like in Timbuktu somewhere, in a small town. They're building amps, and all they really get to do is just take something that's already there before them and kind of improve on little things to their taste. But this is not what Paul Rivera was doing. He was actually like engineering and designing for specific people. And that's where you end up with monsters like this amp, where someone like me, I come in, I'm looking at this, and I have to spend a week with it just to understand what it's supposed to do, right? Yeah. It's not like a plug and play simple, like you just turn up the volume, there you go. It's way more well developed than a standard like consumer type amplifier.
Yes, 100%. And I think, and that's also why the motivation, or where the motivation comes from to kind of talk about Rivera, because we are always talking about these other guys whose names are out there, and they seem to be way bigger. So we're talking about Mike Soldano, we're talking about Dave Friedman, we're talking about who else? Obviously, we're talking about Dumble. You know, Dumble is like everybody seems to be talking about what Alexander Howe Dumble did, and he also started out modifying Fender amps before he then created his own sort of designs. And we always talk about these guys, and all the credit to them. What they did was amazing work, 100%. But essentially, if you look at all the stuff that Paul Rivera did, he took an amplifier that was not intended to sound a certain way, and he made it sound that way, because and that's where I think he deserves all the credit. And if you look at the amps, I think people get confused too easily by certain things. So you said, you look at the amplifier, and you're like, I need a week to go through this, because what he did back then to achieve some of the extended functionality is he was using push-pull potentiometers a lot. And then he incorporated that into the amp lines that he would create with his own company, Rivera Amplification. And people seem to be thrown off by that. But in the end, it's like, if you don't need that extended, if you just want stock, you don't have to, pull out the treble part or the bass part or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you do, you you'll maybe find something that you like better, that fits your needs better, or that, makes the amp more valuable and more flexible for you. So, so I think he started at Valley Arts in 76, and then around the beginning of the 80s, he was actually hired by CBS, who owned Fender back then.
Yep.
And unfortunately, and I'm not saying unfortunately in a bad way, but he was put in a sort of manager or managing position there. He was there to oversee the Fender amp line.
Yeah.
And I'm saying unfortunately because apparently and that's what I could find, apparently the only design that he created was the design of the Super Champ. And then everything else, he obviously had a team of engineers, one of them still being a legend around there, Ed Jans. He was involved in some of those like really like groundbreaking amps that were made at that time. But essentially, Paul had a team of engineers that then would come around and say, hey, here is my proposal for what you want. So Paul said, I want an amp that does that and that we can build for that budget. And then they came around and was like, hey, here is a design. And then he would either approve the design and say, okay, I trust you, go on, move on to the next stage. Or he would not approve it, and then they would have to look into, how to improve the schematics or how to improve the design. And then, so what I could find was that he designed the Super Champ himself, and then he directed the engineers, and they came up with a couple of models. The Bassman 20, which I've never seen the Bassman 20 before. I'm eager to see one.
I haven't either. Yep.
The Champ 2, the Concert, the Deluxe
that's a
Reverb.
great amp.
Yeah, it's a great amp. The Deluxe Reverb 2, the Princeton Reverb 2, the Twin Reverb 2, essentially the second iteration of what was there then with all the improvements. They also created a couple of solid state amps. Some of the names that came up is the Harvard, the London, the Montreux, the Showman, the Stage Lead and Studio Lead, and the Yale Reverb. So those are some of the.
Were they the red knob version of the 80s Fender amps, or did that come later?
No, that came later.
Okay.
Some people assumed that Paul was kind of involved still in the red knob versions of the amps, but he already was out of the company by then.
Okay.
So yeah, those were all solid state amps, and then some really funny thing. The 1983 amp catalog also included rack gear from Fender. So there was the RGP1 preamp and the RGW1 power amp. Yep. Those, however, they were never sold in the end. In the catalog, the price was set TBC, so it was still in the development stage, I would assume. And actually, you shared a couple of... let me find that. All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
So here's an amp that Paul Rivera was involved in from Pictronics, which was called the Crossmix. I haven't found any valuable information on the amp, but just one of these things that he was involved in. Then here you'll see that's the Yamaha 2 Series amplifiers that he was involved in, where he was consulting for. And then you sent me a snapshot of an interview this one, where they actually talk about the. So this is the preamp, and that's the power amp. That has to be like 4 rack units. That is huge.
It looks like it's a monster.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are also some no, come on. Yeah. So there's also you can still, or you can already see some like Rivera DNA in there, because some of the stuff then ended up in his own designs. There is a rack amp that's called the TRB, if I'm not mistaken.
The TRB1, and there are different versions of it, but yeah, the first one was that, yeah.
Yeah. What else do we have? There's another snapshot, I think. Yeah, exactly. So like two channel amp with all the bells and whistles, mid boost. Oh yeah, with built-in reverb as well. And then it's fun. It has this socket here for a panel lamp, which is great, especially if you're operating in the dark.
Yeah, dark stages, because you don't know what the hell you're doing, right? So
yeah, exactly. So those were, the thing is, apparently they were never produced. So what we see here might be the only like Fender branded sort of rack gear things that were done, and then Fender just didn't continue.
Yeah, the snapshots I took is actually a podcast episode. So I watched the whole thing a while back, and then I took some snapshots so we could talk about it in this episode. But essentially what Paul Sr. was saying is that there were two units. So this one here, which is a tube version, and there was another one that was a solid state version that is kicking around somewhere in England right now. He doesn't know where, because what happened, there was a artist representative in England, and Paul Sr. sent him the solid state version saying, look, if you got some artists that want to try it out, let me know what they think, and we're going to develop in that direction. And the rep kind of disappeared, and so did the amp. So there's only two of them, but they were never like mass produced or anything, because a little side note, Paul didn't know it at the time, but when he was hired, CBS already had the intention of getting rid of him. He was kind of like their fall guy. He was coming in. He had to develop a 5-year plan for the company. He had to think up of all these, like taking some of the classic amps, but making them more modern. This was his attempt at trying to make like a professional rig for studio musicians. Because, I mean, we don't, like, for younger players who are listening to this, they might not really know what the gig was about, but back in the 80s and early 90s, everything was about like these fridge filled with rack mount gear. And that particular unit was made so it could play with line level reverb units or whatever. Also, like typical consumer gear that's like whatever minus 10 dB. So you had +4 and -10, and this thing could handle just about anything you threw at it. Because if you were taking like some of those rack units and you would put them through the effects loop of your amp, it would clip. It would sound like garbage. So you had to think about like putting independent volumes for the send and the returns. There's a bunch of engineering stuff there that if you don't really know anything about the gear that was used back in the day, the technology might not make sense for today's application, but for back in those days, that was like revolutionary. He was way ahead of the curve, like way ahead.